Thank you so much for joining us today. I see there's a few people that are still trickling in. Welcome to the talk series for this year, which has been in collaboration with Texte zur Kunst and, of course, Art Cologne. We called this series Fair Enough, and the idea for the series was to bring together artists, curators, writers, thinkers, to reflect a bit about how art and its institutions are responding to the urgencies of the present moment. This season, marking the 35th anniversary of Texte zur Kunst, we took up the journal's motto for the year, "There is no art without criticism." Today's conversation, of course, takes place here at Köln Messe and is the only live discussion that will take place for this year's series. My name is Michaela Dixon, and today we are joined on stage by Hannes Lokinger, who will moderate the conversation. And the conversation will be, of course, about Cologne in the 1990s and Cologne today. Our panelists are Isabel Grau, Dietrich Dietrichsen, Christian Nagel, Monica Spruth, and Andrea Fraser. I will now pass it on to you, Hannes.
Thank you, Michaela, for your welcome, and welcome to all those attending this conversation. We have been invited by Art Cologne and Texte zur Kunst to speak about the following today. Quote, "The panel explores Cologne's significance as a center of the European cultural scene in the 1990s and examines which influences and structures continue to resonate today. In conversation with renowned experts, the discussion will address how the local art and collecting scenes have evolved in comparison to other European contexts." Unquote. The speakers on today's panel require no introduction, particularly in Cologne. It would also take up almost all of our available time to provide a detailed account of their work since the 1980s or 1990s. I will briefly mention what you're doing now and a few aspects that connect you to Cologne in the 1990s. You're welcome to correct me or add other elements of your work later on in the conversation. Let's start with Andrea Fraser. You are an artist, a writer, and currently, amongst many other things, a professor at UCLA School of the Arts and Architecture. Your research focuses on the entanglements between psychoanalysis and socioanalysis, social and financial economies, and, above all, the discourses in the field of art, whether in performative enactments or in your writing. You have been represented by Galerie Nagel, now Nagel Draxler, since the 1990s. In your first ever gallery exhibition that took place at Galerie Nagel in 1990, parallel to Art Cologne, you exhibited a replica of a booth from that very fair. And within it, at the age of 25, a retrospective of your work. If I'm not mistaken, we'll be seeing excerpts from a performance of yours later on, performed at Art Cologne in 1991. Next one is Isabel Graf. You founded the magazine Texte zur Kunst in Cologne in 1990, together with the art historian Stefan Germer, and have been its publisher and executive director ever since. Since 2002, you've been a professor of art theory and art history at the Städelschule in Frankfurt. You also founded the Institute for Art Criticism there, together with Daniel Birnbaum. One of the questions that has preoccupied you for a long time is that of value formation in the field of art. This question runs like a thread through not only your many art critical texts, but also your publications, such as High Price, Art Between the Market and Celebrity Culture, and 3 Cases of Value Reflection, Ponche, Witten, Banksy. Now I come to Monika Sprüth. Welcome. Together with Philomene Magers, you founded the Galerie Sprüth Magers in 1998, which you are still running today. No?
1998.
Didn't I say
the
that?
The gallery was founded in 1983, just by
your gallery, but not the... Okay.
Yeah, but that is the important part, the first 10 years.
Okay. I would have come to that later, but I agree with you.
No, because it's difficult for me if I get introduced like that, especially in a discussion about the 90s.
Okay.
Because it's
yeah.
later, it's something else.
So
the art world changed, you know.
Then let me try again. In 1983, you opened the Monika Sprüth Gallery in Cologne, published the magazine Eau de Cologne 1985, 1987 and 1989, which featured artists like Rosemarie Trockel, Cindy Sherman, Jenny Holzer, Louise Lawler and Barbara Kruger.
And many more.
And many more.
In the last one, Isabel was a cover.
Which is
89.
In the Eau de Cologne.
Which is a difficult topic, I think.
She likes to talk about that.
Endlessly.
Yeah, but let's first finish the round of introductions and come to that. And come to that later on.
We have a small group. Let's have some fun.
Dietrich Dietrichsen, you're an essayist, cultural scientist, curator, and journalist. Before moving to Berlin in the late 90s, you lived in Cologne. In the 1980s, you worked as an editor for the magazines Sounds and Specs. And you're one of the people who published texts in the first issues of the magazine Texte zur Kunst. From 2006 to 2024, you taught Theorie, Praxis und Vermittlung von Gegenwartskunst. Not even the Academy in Vienna has a translation for this on their webpage. At the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. Just last year, your book, Das 21. Jahrhundert Essays, the 21st Century Essays, was published. You've been called the Pope of Pop. What else is there to say? And last speaker on the panel is Christian Nagel. From 1986 to 1988, you ran the Christoph Dürr Gallery in Munich's Villa Stuck, together with Matthias Buck, where you showed exhibitions featuring Kleck and Gottman, Martin Kippenberger, Michael Kreber, Franz West, Heimut Sobernick, Josef Zehrer, and Stefan Dillemuth. And I guess many more.
Dillemuth was not in München.
Okay, very
Cologne.
good. In 1990, you opened your own gallery in Cologne with an exhibition by the artist Cosima von Bonin. In 1992, you were one of the co-founders of Unfair, the real art fair, and if I understand correctly, it was you who suggested to Colin Deland, Pat Hearn, Matthew Marks, and Paul Morris to hold a fair in a hotel, which opened in 1994 as the Gramercy International Art Fair, now known as the Armory Show. Objections? No. You were also one of the initiators of Art Forum Berlin in 1995-1996. Your Berlin space opened its doors in 2002, but as far as I know, you retained a space in Cologne throughout. Okay, I warmly welcome you all. Thank you for participating in this discussion. My question now is, should I start with my questions, or would you want to pick up on anything in the introduction?
Oh, questions.
Yeah, okay, maybe I can start. Because I thought I'm the wrong person for the 1990s, which I still think I am in a way, because I think the 1990s could not have happened the way they happened if the 1980s would not have been in Cologne. And the 1980s was a time where, you know, something like this happens historically. I mean, the Rhineland was always a very area open for art, and a lot of great collectors lived here and everything, and great artists especially. But in the specific German history, you know, we were a bit, not underdogs, but we were careful. In the 80s, it really happened that a younger generation all of a sudden, you know, jumped up, broke certain taboos, started to paint again in a interesting or bad, as some people say, in the expressive bad way, and all of a sudden opened up a new discourse and pointed out again to great artists like Gerhard Richter, Sigmar Polke, even Baselitz, Penck, who have been around but had not been seen international on that level. And this is the moment And it was this young group, there was one group was called Müller Freiheit, Dan, Dokopil, Adamski, and then the other group then came later to Cologne, like Kippenberger, Albert, and Dietrich as a writer. So, and this moment, that was really extremely changed a perspective and made Cologne or Germany again very interesting for New York. So there was a moment where Cologne and New York were supposed to be the center of the art world. And this this is a short version, and this made everything, and there were some established galleries and some who are old ones like me now, or Max Hetzler, who else came then? I don't remember. Jablonka was there. They really showed, and if you see the program these galleries had, those are the artists which are still today the ones who define certain aspects of art history, as far as you can already say that. And this also made it then so lively, so interesting, so cool, I think, I was never part of these parties, but it was like this, And then, the little younger generation, like Christian Nagel, and there were a few other galleries. They came then in the 90s, and they would have never come to Cologne if these 80s would not have had happened, And that's why, for me, in a way, if I think, I don't know, of course, historically how this will be received, years later, but it is really the 80s who were the focus point there, where everything started. So I personally don't remember so much of the 90s, except the unfair. That I thought was a really interesting aspect. The rest, I don't remember so much. That's why I thought I'm wrong here,
I'm sure there's many things to be said, but I would like to pass the word to Dietrich Dietrichsen in this moment with two questions. One is, you've also been living here in the 80s, so how would you describe the changes to the 90s? Secondly, little bit more abstract, what do you think of decades as a model of historization? What concrete negations characterize the 90s from your perspective?
Yeah. Yes, I would say that in general, Cologne had the advantage of this old model of division of labor among German cities in the Federal Republic period, and Cologne and Düsseldorf were the ones that had the job to visual arts to have visual arts as a main cultural event, whereas like Hamburg had media and pop music, and Munich had film and so on. Frankfurt had theory and intellectuals, and Cologne had artists. So that was something that was always there, but I agree with Monika that it was kind of tumultuous, more tumultuous, and it was the invention of the contemporary art market that had grown since then, more or less with some ups and downs, but that visual arts or fine art became a social spectacle. They invented the Galerien. What was it called? Galerientage or something like that, when every gallery would open at the same day. These things that you all know since ages had been new at that time. So that was really a change. The art market was somehow invented, and there were certain practices, old and new, that happened at the same time. But I think these Cologne 80s have been studied a lot. There was a huge show by David Zwirner with a even huger catalog on Cologne and New York. There was the young one.
No?
Not
later.
Okay.
Sorry.
Then there was a Bennett Simpson's show in Philadelphia on Cologne in the 80s and 90s, I think a little bit too. And I was invited to panel discussions on Cologne in the art world of Cologne in the past, in general, 5 times in the last 4 years. So this is the 5th, and the only innovation of this one is that it's the 90s and not the 80s.
Oh, sorry,
But
I
then
didn't know
about
that there-
the question about decades, I think that normally it's a journalistic laziness, but in this case not. 89 really was a shift. It really was a change, and a lot of things that were only digested symbolically or as symbols by the German cultural field in the 70s and 80s, that were kind of always digested as if it was translations, as if it was some kind of entertainment, some symbolical world, all of a sudden became real. And of course, this never happens, that something's only symbolic and then it's only real. But that was the feeling. The feeling was that all these things that existed on a symbolic level now would exist on the real level. And that affected, of course, the arts too. And the other thing was that the main intellectual influence on the cultural world of the 70s and 80s, especially 80s, was more or less, roughly speaking, French theory. And after 89, it was Anglophonic cultural studies, feminism, and anti-racism, so and critique of coloniality. And this shift was also very inspiring for the art world, and it was also something that Cologne didn't have just on their own. It was not just their thing anymore. Different from the previous period where the art world in Germany basically more or less only happened in Cologne. Now it had to share it with intellectuals from Frankfurt, people who had moved to Berlin, and all these other things. So it became more, what do you say, multipolar. No? So that was one question. What was the other one? I think the decades. The
decades and the shift from the 80s to the 90s. So I think you answered both.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Isabel, you're smiling. Would you want to?
You don't have a question for me?
No, I have a question for you, but I don't know if it's still a fit. My question for you was just if you moved to Cologne in the 1990s to found the magazine Texte zur Kunst, or if that was something that was like generated from the circumstances in this city. And speaking about Texte zur Kunst, I also noted that I found a description of Stefan Gammer of the early days of Texte zur Kunst, where it's been described as a decidedly anti-pluralistic magazine, which I found a very interesting observation seen from today. So yeah, maybe you would want to elaborate a bit on the theory that Dietrich Dietrichson sketched in Germany, and that it was suddenly a multipolar world, but then also you moving to Cologne in these years, just like Christian Nagel and many others.
Yeah, I mean, I moved to Cologne in 1988, so the magazine was founded in 1990, and I moved to Cologne from Paris because I was very attracted by an art scene and artistic production, but also by a theoretical kind of discussion that seemed challenging and that seemed to happen in Berlin, and therefore Berlin seemed to be the right place for this idea of founding a magazine
Cologne,
where art criticism would, for the first time maybe in Germany since a long time, also have some sort of theoretical ambition and would have the aim of being at the same time social critique. One must remember that at the time, you know, theory was considered really sexy, and theorists and critics were up in the hierarchy. You know, they were kind of looked up to. It was something people were very interested in. At the same time, I mean, I would also agree with Monika. I think we can't speak about the 90s without speaking about the 80s. But I also have a worry about our discussion when Christian and I joked before that we'll reunite here in order to say how it really was, which of course is impossible. And there is a tendency in each of these iterations of the Cologne historization to do something which in German we call retrospektive Verklärung, meaning you retroactively beautify the events. And even though we are all kind of eyewitnesses and participants in these scenes, we of course have, very, very different views which are very much shaped by today. For instance, I wouldn't agree with Dietrich that that French theory was not so important in the 90s anymore. When I'm thinking of the first issues of Texte zur Kunst, more or less every issue had, either an interview with Bourdieu or Derrida, or, that was still going on.
Because you were from Paris.
Exactly. That's true. I insisted on that. And also
we were reading Stuart Hall. Anyway.
Yeah, but of course, it's also true what Dietrich said. Cultural studies, and at the time it was also called visual studies, was very important for us and for Texte zur Kunst. And this was something that, that differentiated us from October magazine, which basically had a whole academic battle going on against cultural studies and tried to delegitimize the knowledge implied in cultural studies, was also very much against what was called spectacle culture at the time, and often still is, totalized on popular culture. And we with Texte zur Kunst, we were really interested in integrating popular cultural phenomenons and reflecting them as well and taking them seriously. And we also wanted to consider artists as discourse producers. For us, it was very important to integrate artists as authors of the magazine. One last point about the historization of Cologne. There have been indeed many different kind of stations since the early 90s when it comes to this historization, and one of the most extreme ones, I think, was indeed Bennett Simpson's exhibition from 2006 called Make Your Own Life, Artists in and Out of Cologne in the 90s, and it was very much focused on the 90s, also on the 80s, and it did produce also what Merlin Carpenter's painting, which he actually did for the show, called Fantasy of Cologne. There were also a lot of kind of fantasies going on, and I think we have to be aware of that. There is no such thing as the truth about Cologne in the 90s. There are retroactive projections and attempts to make sense of a time that we all lived through.
I agree. Before this panel, a friend sent me a text message that she had seen a room in the Museum of Modern Art in New York called Cologne a few years ago, just like there are rooms like minimalism or anything. So the historization already has happened. I couldn't agree more. So the only way to make this productive is to question it, I would say. But let's still try to stay a little bit in the past. Christian Nagel, why did you come here in the 90s, and what were you doing?
I started a gallery, as you said, in '86 in Munich. I showed basically people. I was about 25 years old. I worked with Matthias Buck. We both were art students in Munich. We listened to lectures of Hans Belting, who was an art historian who contextualized art history, so to speak, together with Martin Warnke. So there was already something we learned as students, that not the artwork in itself is the important thing, but also the surrounding. This was maybe a little reason why later I started to work with people who are summarized as contextual artists. And actually, I was in New York with as a gallerist from München, and I said, can I show this artist? And the colleague said, yes, but not in Munich. And then I said, why? Yeah, Munich is a bee city. Then I said, what? BMW, Siemens, etc., it's all B, but you're right, it's not the art city, apart from maybe Friedrich in Dahlem in the 60s. And then I broke up with my partner, and I had to go somewhere else, and then I decided to come to Cologne, and I opened here in 1990. And something else, the 80s would probably not have happened without the 60s and 70s, yeah, and without Schmiler, Zwirner, Werner, etc. So this was all a post-war thing, which was built in an area where there was not so much emphasis on high bourgeois things, but maybe on contemporary art, and this was a whole line. And maybe Monika Sprüth does not want to speak about the 80s in Cologne so much, because it was also the starting point of the decline of Cologne.
The 90s.
Sorry,
90s.
what did you say? Ich habe nicht verstanden.
Das war auch der Niedergang von Köln, die 90er Jahre. Also this was the time when the people closed, this was the time when the people started to move to Berlin. First the galleries, then the artists, then the magazine, etc., etc. We tried to stay here, we're still here, it's okay, but the 90s were also the end of the development starting in the
Yes.
late 50s.
The end of the division of the arts in old Germany. Everyone moved to Berlin. It's
Yeah.
not only the visual arts.
Yeah.
Andrea, how did all that look from a New York
Oh, God.
perspective?
How did it look from a New York perspective? Well, I came to Cologne for the first time, I think it was the summer of 1990. I met Christian in New York in 89. I met Isabel in New York like in 85.
Right.
Yes. Well, I was at the Whitney program, the Whitney Independent Study program, which I think was an influence.
Indeed.
Certainly on me, and I think also on you, although you weren't a student there, but looking at the theory that was generated there and the critical practices that were developing out of the Whitney program that later became associated largely with institutional critique and with Kontextkunst and framing that really developed here to a large extent, in Cologne. So it's interesting to think about the 80s. Did I cut out? Because I developed in New York in the 80s in a context of a very sort of polemical art discourse, polemics within art discourse and art practice with the new painting that was coming out of, Cologne and Berlin and parts of Italy and other parts of Europe, as well as the US. And the sort of framework of my generation, I think, of institutional critique, neo-conceptualism, critical art practice developed out of that polemic. And I think we saw in Europe, or we found in Europe, and especially in Cologne, a sort of reception for those practices and those perspectives that we didn't find in the US in the same way. And my understanding of that was that it had a lot to do, with the history of the Rhineland specifically, and kind of going back, especially to the 60s and 70s, and the avant-garde galleries of the Rhineland, of Düsseldorf and Cologne, that had been such an important context for conceptual art. And so I think my sense was it was that history that partly created the context for the reception of the neo-conceptualists of my generation. And I had my first gallery exhibition anywhere at the age of 25 here in Cologne in Nagel Gallery, and that was sort of on the heels of Colin DeLand, my art gallery that I was affiliated with in New York, American Fine Arts, came to Art Cologne in '89 with a booth that, I think he threw a couple of videos and some posters in a suitcase and put on Video Fireplace, the Jane Fonda workout tape, and one of my videos, and put some posters up. And this made a big splash, and all of a sudden I started getting calls from all over Europe. It was a different time, clearly, when something like that would actually have an impact at an art fair. But I think there was also a context, in Cologne and in the art fair in Art Cologne that sort of created a reception for that approach. So, yeah. And
Would that be a moment for your video?
Sure.
Yeah. Could
Should we
have
kill
that,
some
please?
time?
think it
Yeah.
would be
So
fun.
in 1990 when I had my exhibition in Nagel Gallery. So you were in the fair in '89. No, you weren't in the fair in '89.
No,
You
when
weren't in
we
the
had to
fair
show
until
you, we were
'91. It was
not
the
in the
first
fair.
time. So I sort of created a replica of an Art Cologne booth in the gallery with the furniture and the wall covering and the floor covering. But then the year after that, in 91, when Christian was at the fair, I came back, oh, yes, that is my exhibition.
We built a booth of the Art Cologne. We took the walls from there, we bought the same floor, and it was like an art fair booth in the gallery, which showed the retrospective of a 25-year-old
25
Andrea
years.
Fraser.
I had very little work. But what I did, the main piece was the book on the table there, which is like a gallery presentation book. But it goes back to, it starts with my exhibition, but it goes back to 1945. And it's an archive of American art in post-war Germany, and especially Cologne. So that was also part of my trying to understand what my reception was and why I was having this first show in Cologne, of all places, as a young American. So it sort of goes through, you know, through the American sort of exportation of American art, through the Museum of Modern Art, through the Marshall Plan initially, the America Houses, the Museum of Modern Art exhibitions of the International Committee that were circulated as part of Cold War policy, and then the establishment of Art Cologne, which had a real focus on pop art in the early years, so that was also part of the context. Yeah, so in 91 I came back and I performed out of Christian Nagel's booth. I performed a piece called May I Help You, and it was the first time that I had performed it myself. Previously it was performed by actors, and we have a video that I just recently edited that was shot mostly by Stefan Dillemot, and there are some other figures who are in the, you see in the video, like Nils Norman and Merlin Carpenter is in there at some point. But can we show that? A little bit. It's a very rough video, but
My favorite part is the ones who crush out of love, just as children collect postage stamps. You fall in love with the thing that pleases you, and you can't resist it. I always prefer pleasure. Pleasant things are non-necessary things. That's our inheritance. Freedom from the lower, coarse, vulgar, servile, material demands of the social world. No, it's the illusion, first of all, that it hasn't been made. That none of this was paid for, and nothing will be bought. It hangs there as if it just spread itself out before us voluntarily, with its own volition. It's always been there and will always be there. The only work you do is I want it and I have it. It's as simple as that. And then you produce its value, an inward value, an emotional value, when you've wanted it, you looked for it, and at last you found it. And you Your collection expresses the texture and quality and even the smell of your life. It permeates everything about you. You're branded by the objects you love. They mark you as the property of your culture, the property of your class. Imagine this picture tattooed on my shoulder. It's like that. Imagine the clothes I'm wearing and the rest of my environment have been taken on myself. And then the whole thing is turned inside out so that it's the stuff inside. The shoes, the soap, the diamond. You know, these are the things. It's always with you. It's inside. And it's outside at the same time for everyone to see. It's a prison. Oh. Certain times of day, the way the light floods into this. I was born into the world thought. My mother, you know, was an extremely cultured and sensitive woman. An attractive, singular worship of the best society, the best individuals, the best standards of living. To be banned. Horrible,
Back.
horrible habits.
Can
They
you-
don't even know how to eat those people. Heavy.
go back a little bit. Okay, you can maybe now.
Well, I suppose I always spoke up for everyone's right to have their own tastes. Why not? At least they have a taste.
Actually,
I think it's
rewind a
charming.
little bit.
It's so simple and fervent.
Okay, maybe now.
If you stuck a piece of shit on the wall, you always think of them as long as someone told them the shit was worth money. That's the nouveau riche approach. And I detest souvenirs. I bought little knickknacks and trinkets I distributed to all and sundry. But I'd never clutter myself up. May we have some quiet in here, please? There was a mob of people in here pushing. I hate crowds filling the air with their breathing and their noise. For example, suburban secretaries who fill their gardens with gnomes, windmills, and similar rubbish. Mummy used to say it's outrageous. Making things like that ought to be banned. Horrible, horrible, horrible habits. They don't even know how to eat, those people. Heavy, thick blood and fat with hunger on cheap foods.
Thank you.
Yeah, we couldn't quite organize the cue points there, but so thank you. So it's watching this. It was kind of extraordinary to imagine. I mean, a gallery today allowing me to do something like that, you know, in their booth at an art fair, just given what the economics of participating in art fairs have become, and how, you know, I think that probably wasn't very good for sales, but I don't know. I did drive people out of the book. It was okay, yeah. But, well, I don't know what we want to say about it.
Yeah. Anybody want to comment on this? Yeah.
I was just thinking about what you said before, referring to your May I Help You performance, about the situation in New York where there was this polarity between, on the one hand, institutional critique, post-conceptual procedures, and on the other hand, what was termed pejoratively at the time neo-expressionist painting. And I was thinking about this dualism and how I think what we try to do, possibly not even so consciously with Texte zur Kunst, was question that polarity. Because when you look at the first issues, you see texts on your work, on Farida Mali's work, on Christian Philipp Müller's work, on René Green's work, juxtaposed next to texts on Jörg Immendorf's work, Kippenberger's work. So I think what I later tried to kind of come to terms with, I was thinking maybe there was something expressive about conceptual practices, and maybe there was something conceptual about these painterly practices. And then I was thinking about your Kunst muss hängen kind of take on Kippenberger's persona, so to speak. So I think that there was an interesting tension there that was very productive, and that maybe also had to do with Cologne's attraction, that both, I mean, I'm totalizing a little bit, but that these approaches coexisted next to each other, negated each other, but also influenced each other a lot, like Kippenberger saying in an interview how important Louise Lawler's work was for him. You know, that this was interesting also in retrospect, I think.
Well, the survivors of the neo-expressionist period, they acknowledged neo-conceptualism, and the other ones we have forgotten. Those who did not acknowledge neo-conceptualist practices, but they existed. They were there.
But I think that also speaks to the sort of reductiveness of the perspectives in New York about neo-expressionism, that there was a lot more complexity among that group of artists and that sort of field of practice that I think was recognized by the critics in the US who were engaged in those polemics.
I have one question. Listening to you speak about the 90s, let's stick to this term for now. It feels like there was an artist-dealer-critic system, a properly working artist-dealer-critic system, maybe also reflected in the people that are sitting on stage today. With that, I mean, there were artists that are maybe influential until today, galleries. We have two representatives sitting here, and also critics. So what was within institutional landscape? This is something also in the different phases of historization of the 90s that I do not properly understand. If that field wasn't of any importance.
I have ear aid here, and I cannot really understand everything you say.
The question is in some way very simple. Seen from now, it feels like there was an artist-dealer-critic system in the 90s in Cologne. In all these phases of historization, there's not so much talk about Kunstvereine or museums or places like this. In this Cologne scene seems to have been determined by what artists did, what critics wrote, and what gallerists showed. Is that just my impression, or is that something that you could explain as a mode of production back then?
I mean, the gallery system was always very tense and very self-organized, and the people who had good galleries know what they did, and they organized their distribution and their exhibition themselves. Of course, there were people who showed it in Kunstverein, in museums, and things like this. At this time, the director of the Cologne Kunstverein was interested in something else. So therefore, there was not really a lot of collaboration. Same with Düsseldorf, and same with the Mönchengladbach, Krefeld, and the centers which show early on important young artists. And so this was like it was, and it was also sometimes a little bit frustrated, because not the outside apart was far away in a way, but it was also okay. We could survive. There was a show in Firminy in France with Yves Artipitalot. There was Dirk Snauwart in the Palais des Beaux-Arts, which had a smaller exhibition space in these days, where he showed Farida Amalin, Christian Philipp Müller, and other positions. So it was not the fact that there was no connections to Institute or Kunstverein. It was just the fact that in the near neighborhood people had a different idea.
Right, perhaps. I mean, Helmut Draxler was at the Kunstverein in Munich, and he was
Also,
he was maybe the curator who was most engaged, I think, with this particular group of artists, and quite a number of us that worked with him in the Kunstverein. And then, in Lüneburg there was Ulf Hugenig and Beatrice von Bismarck, and the development of the Kunstraum there. And then Graz was also an important in Vienna and Graz. So there were sort of particular people in particular institutional contexts, but not in Cologne for the most part. Yeah.
I think I would agree with you that the Cologne art scene since the 60s, I would argue the post-war Cologne art scene was an example of what Harrison and Cynthia White termed the dealer-critic system, a system where dealers in tandem with critics basically kind of profile art, position art, and propagate art, and also market art. And I think that one could maybe, and I tried to do that in my book, High Price, consider the 90s also as the beginning of a structural change of the art economy in this respect. I think that in the course of the 90s, a system that had formerly been dominated by retail businesses, Einzelhandel, shifted to galleries opening branches, operating more internationally, later even globally. And also the former dealer-critic system, I think, got slowly substituted what I termed in my book High Price the dealer-collector-curator system. I think that the power of the critics and theoreticians, especially in the mercantile sphere, diminished toward the end of the 90s. I think really, even though we think of the 90s as this decade where discourse was celebrated, I think at the same time a restructuring of the whole field was slowly going on, and we are dealing with its repercussions today, where criticism is indeed in many segments of the art world quite marginalized.
It helped a lot to think of the art world but now in the 80s rather than in the 90s, as a continuation of the way political groups had formed and were organized in the 70s, but without the politics. So it was like communist splinter groups, and one was opting for one of them, or one could even tolerate maybe another one, and the rest were traitors or revisionists. And so that was how I learned to look at galleries, and it was very amusing and pleasing to look at it like this. And later it turned out they all had also different artists, and they were going for variety and diversity, and so it was no longer you could no longer keep this idea that they were all like had a specific message, a specific idea that they were following, and would function like curators. So that was, I think, how one looked at galleries in the 80s. That they were curated by someone, and if a gallery had a new artist, it was like, are you sure that it works with this gallery, this artist? It was also like Bundesliga clubs. I mean, you couldn't. This player could not play with Borussia Dortmund, but he could play maybe with Hoffenheim. So this was like as long as you could look at it like this, I think also the galleries profited from that. Even if they were not feeling like this, they also liked this fantasy, and that of course was gone in the 90s pretty soon. Maybe not in 1990, but by 1993, 1994, this was over.
Mm-hmm. So we have now the 80s were important, but not the 90s. We have heard in the 1990s beginning of the decline of Cologne. We also have heard that the 90s have been historized to death, and that there happened a structural change. So this is a bit of a surprise, but picking up on this statement, I realized that you, Isabel, in several interviews, you mentioned a book that has not been written yet, The Dark Years, Cologne from 1987 to 1999.
88 to 99.
88 to 99, thank you. I also realized that there have been 3 issues on Berlin with Texte zur Kunst, but not a single one on Cologne.
It's coming.
It's coming, okay.
Don't worry.
Still, what is this, the dark years of Cologne?
Well, first of all, I would pick up on what Dietrich said, because I think it's also something I would actually love to discuss with Monika. This idea that in the 80s, early 90s, we were dealing with something that was called program gallery at the time, a Programmgalerie, which has a cohesive aesthetic proposition and sticks with the artists it represents for a whole course of a career, meaning 30 to 40 years. And I think that this model has very often been replaced nowadays for reasons of the economization of this field by a model where galleries either lose their artists to mega players, like a Gauguin or Hauser und Wirth, and where galleries can't really afford to kind of stick to a position that is not market successful because they have large overheads. So I think this is something that is interesting to think about if the program gallery is actually still possible nowadays. And about the dark years, in German it sounds better, die dunklen Jahre, Köln 1988 bis 99. I think I came up with this title, and the book hasn't been written yet. I came up with this title because my memories of this time are always black and white. And it's not color, there's no color, it's grayish. And of course, even though the 90s were a time where, the cultural left in Germany once again discovered not only feminist theory, but also gender studies, and this is something Texte zur Kunst, I think, contributed to. We very early on, had an interview with Judith Butler, and were very engaged and did several issues on feminisms, sexisms, etc. We are now again doing an issue on misogyny, because this topic never stops being topical, especially in today's time. But at the same time, there was a lot of structural sexism going on as well. So, which we talked about, especially my female friends, colleagues and mine, we talked about it, we tried to understand it, theorize it. So it was, it was a time, Jutta Köter and I always say, we are happy that we actually survived it. And we are also happy it's over. So there is no reason to be nostalgic, even though there were a lot of things that were also great about this time, but there were also aspects which I'm happy that I don't have to repeatedly go through certain experiences that I was exposed to during the 90s as a person marked as a woman in this scene.
Monika Sprühl, would you like to pick up on this notion of the Programmgalerie?
Yeah, okay. I mean, when I hear this discussion, I must say, I understand, and I think certain things, how the art market developed, are interesting. I personally have still a very old-fashioned idea of what I'm still doing it, having the gallery. It's just about a certain vision of what is of any cultural necessity to discuss, and that's why I fell into the situation that I had to discuss or the role of women in the art world. That's why there was a reason. I mean, I not only wanted to have the gallery 2 years, but one thing was in these days that there was a necessity to pick on all these interesting female artists in order to help them to become role models, But till today, I must say, I understand the discussion, but for myself, the only thing which keeps me doing this is to think, where's the necessity to support some in the artistic discourse which could be of any cultural necessity, And this is for me, very easy in the 80s, still okay in the 90s to find artists who fulfilled this, where I thought I put my energy into the gallery. Today it's almost impossible. I don't have the possibility. I cannot do this. I need a long time to how do you say that? Define between the less important and the more important. It's very difficult, where are these discourses? Because it's so, and the art market is so degenerate. So that's why a program gallery, yes, you can call it a program gallery, you can say it's over. But for example, the interesting development lately is that quite a few artists, they are very unhappy with the new role model, these mega galleries, even though because they're older, so they went there because they thought this is a safe, money-wise, a safe situation for us, They're very unhappy at the end there. And you will see in the future, a few will leave certain galleries. And, even though it might be a financial risk for them, because most artists also really have a vision, they know, and this cannot, so I don't know, I cannot, that's why I cannot really follow that discussion, because I have this really old-fashioned idea of try to find what is of any, not that our gallery is perfect there, but at least we try, to distinguish a bit from the more important and the less important, and try to support this in a very simple way. And this is called, and try to you know, and when you start to discuss this, you try to support the artist, and that's why that's called old-fashioned. It's a program gallery, okay, maybe, you know, but it's. I mean, what's the role of a gallery? You know, it's just to be the servant of the artist at the end. And when you, I mean, in our case, you know, I mean, you can also survive financially. You know, it's not easy. You know, I mean, me with my specific history, I always say I should be the richest of all. You know, and I'm probably one of the poorest. I mean, I'm not poor, you know, but the poorest of all. It's just, you know, it's not about. In our case, it's not about money, but as you said, it is about money today. You know, that's the reality. But as I said, it might change a bit. You know, I don't know. It's not. I'm sorry. It's not really my you know. It's not my discussion so much.
Yeah, well, what I'm thinking about, I mean, there's a sort of narrative of you know, that there was a sort of functional division of labor between and kind of collaborative set of relations between dealers, artists, and critics through the program gallery that also had a curatorial role, and there's this model, and that somehow now has transformed or degenerated, which is one way of looking at it. I think the model that I've been thinking within, and I don't have that slide up, but is the fragmentation of the art field into what I describe as increasingly autonomous subfields, where, you know, that kind of collaborative, or when one kind of considers the field of galleries, or the art market field, the field of art discourse or discourse production, or the knowledge production, or the academic field and the exhibition field, sort of in the same space, and there's a relations of collaboration, but also of contestation over what the sort of values, you know, of as a whole are. And I think one way of understanding the shift is that, in fact, these subfields now have sort of fragmented to a large extent. And so the field of art discourse is increasingly academicized. The field of the market field is increasingly sort of defined within a particular economy, which is primarily painting, you know, which is 80% of the market by value. And then the exhibition field has taken its own kind of course through the rise of the curatorial studies and museum studies and exhibition studies and international exhibitions. And so within this sort of fragmentation, you know, it's hard for me now to kind of think about what the role that, you know, galleries have or art criticism has really kind of across, you know, with galleries, whether art discourse can really have, you know, it's one way of understanding how the sort of decline of the influence of art discourse within the market field is that they're actually functioning now independently almost as sort of specific economies. And so as an artist, you know, sort of my way of trying to function within the art world is about sort of thinking about those arenas very specifically and how I can function, you know, within them, but within sort of very specific limits of what those different arenas are at this point. So I don't know if that's, you know, if that's helpful, but I think we've kind of gotten past the decline, and we can keep thinking about the sort of the decline of the old model, but what has taken its place now is something that I think has a very different structure.
Yeah, I agree, and ultimately. I think we have to think in terms of a structural shifts, in terms of different segments that, yes, each function according to their own laws and criteria, but also overlap. There are still overlaps, you know, like say in the biennial.
There's a certain sort of interdependency,
exactly.
Which I actually think of more as a sort of parasitism, you know, where the market still needs the legitimation and the kind of public profile and the framework of a public good created by the academic and exhibition fields. The exhibition fields needs the money from the market, otherwise, you know, it'd go bankrupt. And the academic field wants this access to sort of broader cultural relevance as well as to resources that they get to the other fields. So there's this, but it's a kind of parasitical, I think, relationship to a large extent now. I mean, because it's not one of contestation to a large extent, I think, at this point. And that's one of the things that was, for me, quite lost.
Yeah, that's interesting. One little point, I don't want to talk that much, but I'm just thinking about how, if we go back to these 90s, how I remember, also in relation to Texte zur Kunst, that artists were very interested in a controversial discussion about their work. They enjoyed it even if substantial kind of counter-arguments against their practice were being formulated. Some even said that this is why they made work, because they wanted a controversy to happen around it. And this has changed a lot, also for economical reasons, also for many other reasons. First of all, many artists nowadays don't like it at all if one critical word is uttered about their work. There's also critics who are rightly a bit fearful to write something critical because they fear the repercussions. They might not be invited to the dinner anymore, or not be invited to write a catalog text. So there is, in place of this kind of interest in controversy, there's now more a kind of longing for agreement. And that has really changed the field for me, also from the point of view of running a magazine. Because for me, it only gets interesting once there is disagreement. Otherwise, it gets a little bit boring.
I agree.
Yeah, maybe this would be a good moment to also open the conversation to the audience, disagreements, questions, comments. I think we have a microphone. Where is it? Ah, you have to stand up and walk to the microphone. Would there be anyone who would want to contribute to this conversation at this moment? Yeah, please.
Hello, thank you so much for the panel. It was lovely. I have a question for Andrea Fraser, because we just saw you in the video acting as the gallerist in the booth. And I think it would be maybe interesting to hear how you would do it today, given all the economic stress, and how would a performance possibly look like today? Or is that something that you would never want to do again? Could also be.
Well, thank you for the question. I still actually perform May I Help You? And I performed it in Italy last year. And it remains surprisingly relevant in a certain way. But it's also nostalgic for me, because May I Help You was a performance very much, it's about taste. It's about taste and class. And it's sort of premised on the idea that collecting is somehow about taste and is relevant in an art gallery, in an art fair. And now I'm not sure that's this so much the case anymore. I mean, we didn't speak, for example, about the role of art advisors now, and the degree to which collectors are collecting according to their taste is, in my mind, somewhat questionable, as market factors, as factors that have to do with sort of positioning oneself and one's collection within a kind of field of collectors. So that would be a shift of sort of considering how to address that. So it is something that I think about, but I'm not sure what gallery would let me do that. Christian, would you let me do a performance in your booth again at an art fair?
You will always have a carte blanche. So
okay. So
yes,
maybe Basel.
But there are still some galleries who give artists these possibilities.
Yes, but if I'm yelling at people, in the middle of Art Basel, you think
it's. But of course, there are. It's different because we have the other side also. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But it's not that desperate. I mean,
well, that's great. That's great to hear. I'm an avid reader of the Art Basel UBS Art Market Report, and I'm sort of very interested in, on the one hand, the sort of interviews with art dealers and other players in the art world that are sometimes quoted in that publication and elsewhere, which include, you know, a lot of, well, certain complaints about collectors, for example, that one never hears outside of, you know, that context. And so to think about, like, how can one bring a sort of a critical dialogue back into the sphere of art galleries, of the art market, and maybe a performance like that would be sort of one way of pushing on that, pushing against the you know, the sort of reduction of art discourse to a discourse of affirmation, which I think is one of the things that Isabel was, you know, was talking about, which definitely I
That's
think
a question.
oh, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to add something to what Isabel said about you know, critics maybe today being more afraid of losing, you know, their privileges of belonging to a system rather than keeping the discourse alive by having controversial viewpoints with artists and dealers. The discussion is called Cologne in the 90s and now. And the 90s, you know, were a time where the blocks just had collapsed and everybody was thinking that democracy and open discourse is like the role model that will spread maybe globally. Today we're living in a very different reality, and I think this has arrived in art world. When I hear especially colleagues in the United States, they are afraid to show certain positions right now, political positions in their galleries. So I think it's we haven't even realized the now, from the 90s till now, what this really means on the brink of fascism globally. And I think we're going to face a very different next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you, thank you, Saskia. I also think, you know, I totally agree, and I think another blind spot of our discussion was that when looking back at the 90s, 80s, I mean, we were dealing still with an analog world. People were actually meeting in concrete places here in Cologne and having face-to-face interactions, whereas now we are dealing with an art world which has partly at least been taken over by the tech industry, and where many of its interactions take place on Instagram, which is of course also, when it comes to critical controversy, a very different place where you know, quantitative judgments reign, meaning the number of followers or likes determines what is considered relevant. So we are really, I agree with you, we haven't even started to kind of grasp these changes. We are really living in a very different world in many, many respects.
No, exactly. I think, I mean, this is really interesting. Of course, it's more, of course, in the US taking place, or the fear, or the reality and the fear is there politically. And yeah, this is something which is, I mean, it doesn't really, you know, we have all the galleries in the US, it doesn't really affect so far the galleries there, but it's a climate, which is really, really very unpleasant. But this is another discussion. I mean, this discussion is the 90s and now. I mean, the now is should be, you know, we should start with the now then, you know, and which is not really related. And I mean, as she says, you know, analog and digital, you know, that is something which is very interesting. You know, I mean, I'm still thinking in the old way, but the reality is that we have to focus on this, especially, you know, if you see the change in the institutions, what they show, and that is something very, it's a very serious, I think, aspect to think about. But I mean, that would take more time.
Yeah, I mean, as an American, and yes, I really hope everybody, all the galleries, pull out of Art Basel, Miami, and, you know, run the fair out of that fascist state. But I also want to note that I've talked to a lot of people who've left Germany in the past few years because they have been unable to criticize Israel and because they have been targeted for criticizing Israel. So it's also an issue here.
Exactly. Yeah,
in the
it's
US.
true, but still, it's a bit.
I mean, it's a different political context.
No, it's true. I mean,
but
there was
is
this
an
moment,
impact on
I
artists
forgot
that
about
has
that.
been
Yes.
very strong here as well. So, of censorship. So.
Ich würde gerne nochmal an die Frage von Saskia anschließen und ob man die nicht auch ein bisschen anders stellen kann, weil so pleasant war die Situation in den 90ern ja auch nicht. Es war ein sehr offenes Feld, was sich nach dem Zusammenbruch der Sowjetunion eröffnet hat.
Könntest du Englisch sprechen, Hans-Christian, wegen Andrea?
Sorry. I'm wondering if the situation was so pleasant in the early 90s. I mean, it was a very open situation after the collapse of the the UdSSR. And also the situation in Germany was very unclear in the moment of the reunification. I mean, there had been a lot of violence, right-wing violence. Yeah. It was the beginning of the civil war in Yugoslavia. The internet was appearing. It was the same situation like now. Many people had been afraid, like people are now afraid of artificial intelligence. So isn't there also comparison that there's an open situation now with a lot of insecurity, or wasn't it also a quite insecure situation in 1990?
Well, I do think that the internet now has just created...
When the first Gulf War started, everything was over. We just opened the gallery a year ago. We were sitting in the Grüne Eck at 5 o'clock in the morning. The war should start in Kuwait, and we were still drinking and watching what happened, and the war started. And from that point of, nobody traveled anymore. The collectors, I mean, they did not. This was not happening in the last events, in this last war event. But then everything was over, and my colleague and close friend Colin DeLand said, "Stay alive till '95," and it was even '98 when there was a renaissance of the painting stuff again, that the market started again. So the '90s were really, really difficult, and the biggest recession was in the early 90s, not in the later recession days.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking of the racist pogroms, which happened in Rostock and Mölln in the beginning of the 90s, and which was one of the reasons as to why we founded the so-called Wohlfahrtsausschuss at the time, which one day maybe also one would have to historicize critically, which was a kind of formation of people from the cultural left, both from the music world, mostly from Hamburg, but also from the art world. And we had a trip, Dietrich and I actually shared, not a hotel room, but we were in the same hotel. I remember that. But anyway, we were in a bus and going to East Germany, and the idea was, which is sounding rather colonial from today's point of view, the idea was to kind of have these anti-racist, anti-sexist discussions with like-minded people from the East and to support the anti-racist initiatives in the East. But we came like these kind of hipsters from Cologne and Hamburg in a way to tell them about what we thought was going on. So in a way also slightly problematic, and it also failed in many ways, but it was also important that that we did something. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. And is there something to be learned from this for the now?
I think one thing is to mention something about Cologne, to relocalize the discussion from the global fascist threat. And I think it's a big difference, of course, that there is a fascist threat right now, or almost already realized in several parts of the world. But the other string, or the other threat that has been mentioned, the tendency of fragmentation, which I think is, as well as was what Isabel was saying about the rejection of certain forms of criticism, a phenomenon that's not exclusive to the art world. It's like in all cultural fields, the same thing. And the fragmentation that happens right now in the book world, the book market, where the Frankfurt Book Fair now has only one place, one hall, or whatever the things are called, left for like what used to be their main business. The rest is adult fantasy. But Cologne has a natural tendency to resist fragmentation because of its village-like psychogeography. Because people might look at Instagram as much as they want, but they have seen each other 4 times a day already on the street. So this is a different thing from all the other places where one can live, where you see someone every 6 months and only see your neighbors. But here, everyone is your neighbor, and that was also an important factor of the attractive sides of Cologne in the 80s and 90s. But it's still there. It's just that there is no game that everyone plays together. But it's possible, and it could be a game. I mean, certain games are played together, but it could be something that could support any kind of like coherent cultural activity or political cultural activity better than other cities could do that. No?
And what was also so interesting about the social life that we were leading in Cologne is that it took place outside of the apartments.
Yeah.
There were all these spaces like bars, restaurants, and even the street and the bookshop, where you would spend your life outside.
That's very true.
That's so important, and this is why you would have all these encounters and interactions. And I always loved thinking about Kippenberger's "Bitte nicht nach Hause schicken" painting in this regard, "Don't send me home," because I thought there was also one resonance this painting has for me is this: don't send me home, because I want to stay in this kind of outside world where social interactions happen. We never met in our apartments ever.
Yeah.
We didn't even know each other's apartments.
Yeah. You know, this is like it's very interesting. This is in Klaus Teweleit's look back upon the early days of politicization in the 60s in Germany. He says, has this term Aushäusigkeit.
Das ist gut.
To be out of the house. No? This is that was really a noun. The other thing is that I just read this Erika Tomalla book on the history of literary journalism or ambitious journalism in Germany, where someone's talking about Cologne in around 1990, saying, we never ever has anyone invited anyone for dinner.
Yes.
That was absolutely no one would ever do that.
And nobody could cook.
Yeah.
Not true, but so funny.
No performance kitchens.
Okay, but maybe this optimism is now a good moment to end this panel. Thank you so much for not really agreeing on what Cologne in the 90s was, or if it was even important, but for these amusing closing words. Thank you very much.
Thank you.